1987, Rancho Cucamonga, promised Tio the Prince of Hell, the 6 years that destroyed 3 houses. In the quiet residential streets of Rancho Cucamonga, California, where the majestic San Gabriel Mountains guard the horizon and vineyards stretch beneath the relentless desert sun, 3 white houses stood side by side on Archibold Avenue. It was the summer of 1987, and the Moffitt family had not the slightest suspicion that their lives were about to become a documented nightmare that would defy all rational explanation for the next 6 years. The family property seemed taken from an American dream. 3 homes connected by a shared expansive lot, where 3 generations of the Moffitt family had built their intertwined lives. The first house belonged to Dominica, the 82-year-old matriarch whose health was declining with the inevitability of the seasons. In the central dwelling resided Bill Sr. and his wife Lena, whom everyone affectionately called Lee, a devout 60-year-old Catholic woman whose face reflected the serenity of one who had known only normalcy. The third property, inherited years earlier, now housed Bill Jr. and his young wife Deborah, a 27-year-old woman newly arrived in California, completely oblivious to the ancestral horror that slumbered within those walls. The August heat stuck to the skin like a silent warning. Inside Dominica's house, where curtains remained closed to maintain coolness, a Guatemalan woman named Juanita devotedly cared for the dying elderly woman. No one in the family suspected then that this caregiver practiced Santeria, a dark fusion between Catholicism and Afro-Cuban Spiritism, where blood and bones speak forbidden languages. No one imagined that in the shadows of that closed room, between black candles and bird feathers, something that had been waiting for centuries was being invoked. On the night of August 23, 1987, Dominica exhaled her last breath. Her death was peaceful, surrounded by her family's love. But what occurred barely 3 hours after her passing would make the Moffitts question everything they believed they knew about reality. Juanita, who was supposed to collect her belongings and leave, called out to Deborah with a heart-wrenching scream that pierced the California night like the howl of a wounded animal. When Deborah and Bill Jr. ran from their house toward the grandmother's dwelling, they saw Juanita hurtling down the stairs in absolute panic, her bulging eyes fixed on something floating behind her. Deborah would never forget what she witnessed in those eternal seconds. A luminous sphere the size of a basketball, pulsating and of a color that couldn't be described with human words, pursued Juanita as if it had consciousness and intention. The energy ball rose above the house, spun in the night air, and dissolved into the darkness with a sound similar to the sigh of 1,000 voices extinguishing simultaneously. Juanita, lying on the lawn and trembling violently, could only articulate a warning before fleeing forever from Archibold Avenue. Never return to that house. Never. He has awakened and comes to collect what was promised to him centuries ago. Inside Dominica's dwelling, Lee and Deborah discovered days later what Juanita had left hidden. Consumed candles surrounded by circles of black salt, chicken feathers tied with human hair, and in the center of everything, dozens of Catholic rosaries meticulously destroyed, each bead separated and placed forming symbols that neither of the 2 women recognized but which provoked an immediate visceral discomfort. On the wall, barely visible under layers of candle smoke, someone had traced with dried blood a sign that looked like an eye inside an inverted star. When Lee tried to clean it, she felt a burning so intense in her hand that she had to submerge it in ice water for 20 minutes. That night marked the beginning. The Moffitts, a traditional Catholic family settled in California for 3 generations, were about to face a presence that would identify itself by writing on their mirrors a name that would freeze the blood in their veins. I am the prince. Lee was promised to me. I have come to claim her. And what followed during the next 2,190 days was not an ordinary ghost story, but a siege documented by hundreds of photographs, testimonies from internationally renowned paranormal investigators, and the absolute terror of a family that would discover that not all contracts are signed in life, and not all debts can be canceled with prayers. The San Gabriel Mountains remained standing on the horizon, indifferent and eternal, while in the 3 white houses on Archibold Avenue something began to manifest that demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, when they arrived 2 years later, would qualify as one of the most violent and persistent demonic infestations they had ever investigated in their 4 decades of career. Deborah had arrived in California in the spring of 1984 with her heart full of hope and a worn suitcase. Originally from the Midwest, where winters were brutal and opportunities scarce, she had met Bill Jr. at a business conference in Chicago. He was a hard-working 32-year-old man, with calloused carpenter's hands and a smile that illuminated his sun-weathered face. They married barely 6 months later, in a simple ceremony in a Catholic church in San Bernardino, and Deborah crossed the country to begin her new life under the perpetually blue sky of Southern California. The Moffitt family represented everything Deborah had dreamed of: stability, tradition, and unconditional love. Bill Sr., a 65-year-old man with silver hair and a deep voice that inspired confidence, had worked for 40 years in construction until retiring with a modest but sufficient pension. Lee, his wife, was the soul of the extended family, a petite woman with dark eyes who cooked for 20 people every Sunday after Mass and never let anyone leave her house without a container full of homemade food. Sundays on Archibold Avenue smelled of tomato sauce simmering slowly, freshly baked bread, and Italian coffee so strong it could wake the dead, an expression that years later would acquire a sinister meaning. The family property in Rancho Cucamonga had been acquired by Lee's parents in 1952, when the area was little more than agricultural fields and citrus farms. Over the years, the family built the 3 houses on the half-acre lot. Dominica, Lee's mother, occupied the first dwelling, a modest 2-bedroom construction with a covered porch where she used to sit every sunset to watch the mountains. The central house, the largest with 3 bedrooms and a spacious basement, belonged to Bill Sr. and Lee. The third property, originally belonging to Bill Jr.'s aunt who died childless in 1978, remained as an inheritance for the young couple. During the first 3 years, life on Archibold Avenue transpired with the placidity of a summer river. Deborah found work as a secretary in an accounting firm in Ontario, only 20 minutes away by car. Bill Jr. continued his carpentry business, crafting custom furniture in the garage transformed into a workshop. On weekends, the entire family gathered in the shared garden for barbecues that lasted until the sun sank behind the mountains, tinting the sky orange and purple. Lee told stories of old Italy, of her Sicilian grandparents who arrived at Ellis Island with nothing more than their names and their Catholic faith. Bill Sr. taught his grandchildren to identify constellations in the clear desert night sky. In 1985, when Dominica turned 82, her health began to deteriorate rapidly. Doctors diagnosed congestive heart failure and gave her between 6 months and a year to live. Lee, devastated at the idea of losing her mother but determined to keep her comfortable and dignified, decided to hire a full-time caregiver. Through a local agency, they met Juanita Ramirez, a 45-year-old Guatemalan woman who had arrived in the United States a decade earlier. Her English was limited but functional, and her references were impeccable. She had experience caring for the elderly and seemed genuinely affectionate with Dominica from the first day. Juanita moved into the guest room in Dominica's house in March of 1985. She was a quiet woman, robustly built with strong hands, her black hair always pulled back in a tight braid. She wore a silver crucifix that hung over her chest and attended Mass every Wednesday at a Catholic church in downtown Rancho Cucamonga. Lee considered her a blessing from heaven, especially when Dominica began having good days after weeks of constant decline. The elderly woman regained her appetite, slept better, and even joked about living to 100. Lee attributed this improvement to Juanita's devoted care and the prayers the caregiver constantly murmured in Spanish while preparing Dominica's meals. What the Moffitt family didn't know was that Juanita practiced something much older and darker than the superficial Catholicism she publicly displayed. In her native Guatemala, she had been initiated into Santeria at 16 by her grandmother, a powerful Santeria known in 3 provinces for her ability to invoke the Orishas, African deities syncretized with Catholic saints. Juanita knew how to work with blood, bones, cemetery dirt, and words in languages that preceded Spanish by 1,000 years. And when she saw that Dominica was inexorably approaching death despite modern medicine's best efforts, Juanita decided to intercede with methods the family had never imagined. In the silent nights of July 1985, while Dominica slept with the help of morphine and the family rested in their respective houses, Juanita performed ceremonies in the elderly woman's room. She lit black candles purchased from a botanica in Los Angeles. She sacrificed chickens bought at a Mexican market, collecting the blood in ceramic bowls and tracing symbols on the wooden floor that she then cleaned before dawn. She prayed not to Jesus or Mary, but to entities with names that sounded like distant thunder. Elegua, guardian of the roads; Oya, owner of cemeteries; and darker ones, those that have no Catholic equivalents because they were never angels or saints, but something prior, something that existed when the world was young and wild. Juanita sought to prolong Dominica's life, to fulfill her job perfectly and ensure her reputation as an exceptional caregiver. But in her desperation to obtain results, she made the mistake that would forever change the Moffitt family's destiny. She invoked an entity whose real name she never pronounced aloud, a spirit that presented itself as a prince of forgotten realms, and offered it something that didn't belong to her. In a ritual performed in the early morning of August 15, 1985, Juanita promised the spirit Lee's soul, Dominica's daughter, in exchange for 6 more months of life for the elderly woman. The contract was sealed with black rooster blood poured over photographs of Lee that Juanita had discreetly taken over several weeks. The entity accepted the terms, but with a condition that Juanita didn't fully understand until it was too late. The prince would wait for the exact moment of Dominica's death to manifest and claim what had been promised. And when that moment arrived, nothing in heaven or earth could stop him from collecting his debt. For 2 years, life on Archibold Avenue continued without apparent incidents. Dominica lived until August 1987, exactly 24 months after Juanita's ritual, defying all medical prognosis. The family considered her longevity a miracle of modern medicine and constant prayers. Lee prepared her mother's favorite meals, Bill Sr. read the newspaper aloud every morning in Dominica's room, and Deborah visited daily with fresh flowers from the garden. No one noticed Juanita's worried glances, nor how the caregiver had begun sleeping with all lights on, nor the frantic murmurs in Spanish that escaped her lips when she believed she was alone. The calm before the storm lasted exactly 730 days. And when the storm finally broke that August night, when Dominica closed her eyes for the last time and something ancient and hungry awakened in the shadows of those 3 white houses, the Moffitt family would discover that some contracts transcend death, and some debts are paid with more than money or apologies. The first 14 days after Dominica's death transpired in the expected mourning of a traditional Catholic family. The funeral was held at St. Peter's Church, the same where Lee had been baptized 60 years earlier. More than 100 people attended the wake, filling the central house with the aroma of white flowers and the constant murmur of rosary prayers. Deborah organized the reception, preparing endless trays of food while Lee remained seated in her favorite chair, accepting condolences with the silent dignity of one who has lost her mother but finds comfort in faith. Dominica's house remained empty and silent. Bill Sr. suggested waiting at least a month before cleaning it and preparing it for rent. It was too soon, too painful to remove the matriarch's belongings. But on September 14, 1987, exactly 22 days after the passing, Lee decided it was time to begin. She needed to keep busy, keep her hands and mind away from the emptiness left by her mother's absence. She took her rosary, tucked it into her flowered apron pocket, and crossed the garden toward the silent house with a cardboard box under her arm and determination in every step. Deborah accompanied her, unable to let her mother-in-law face that melancholic task alone. They opened the windows to let in the fresh September air, that desert air that smells of sage and warm earth. The house smelled closed, with that particular aroma of uninhabited spaces where dust settles in invisible layers. They began with the main bedroom, folding sheets and checking drawers, when Lee opened the closet and froze in the threshold. "Deborah," she whispered with a voice that trembled almost imperceptibly, "what is this?" On the closet floor, hidden behind boxes of old shoes, there was a perfect circle traced with what appeared to be dark salt, almost black. In the center of the circle rested the remains of 3 candles completely consumed, surrounded by bird feathers tied with human hair. But what made both women instinctively step back was the silver crucifix buried upside down in the center, surrounded by dozens of rosary beads scattered, forming a deliberate pattern that neither of them recognized but which provoked a visceral sensation of discomfort. "Juanita," Deborah murmured, feeling her stomach contract. It must have been Juanita. Lee took out her own rosary from her pocket with trembling hands and began praying in a low voice while Deborah photographed the scene with her Polaroid camera, a habit she had developed since becoming the person in charge of documenting family events. The photograph revealed slowly, showing the black circle and candles, but when both women looked at the fully developed image, they felt a simultaneous chill. In the photograph appeared a human shadow projected on the closet wall, despite the fact that neither of them had been in position to create that shadow when the image was taken. They cleaned the closet with holy water that Lee kept in a bottle in her house, collected every rosary bead and every feather with rubber gloves, and burned everything in a metal barrel in the backyard. The flames crackled with a strange sound, almost like sighs, and the smoke rose in a perfectly straight column despite the constant breeze blowing from the mountains. When they finished, both felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. That night, Lee woke at 3:15 in the morning with the absolute certainty that someone was standing next to her bed. The room was plunged in complete darkness, but she could feel a presence, something breathing with a slow and deliberate rhythm. She reached out seeking Bill Sr., but her husband slept deeply beside her, completely oblivious. Lee turned on the bedside lamp with trembling fingers. The room was empty. But when she got up to go to the bathroom, she discovered something that made her heart stop for a complete beat. On the bathroom mirror, written with what appeared to be white soap, was a message in large, crude letters. "Lee, I know you. I have waited," Lee screamed. Bill Sr. woke startled and ran to the bathroom, where he found his wife pointing at the mirror with a completely pale face. He saw the message, rubbed his eyes believing he was dreaming, and then saw it again. They checked the entire house. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows sealed. There were no signs of forced entry. They cleaned the message with a towel, but the soap left an oily residue that seemed to resist disappearing completely. "It was a bad joke," said Bill Sr., trying to sound convincing although his own voice trembled. "Someone entered while we were at your mother's funeral. It's the only logical thing." But Lee knew, with that instinctive certainty that requires no rational proof, that no human had written that message. The following 3 days brought an escalation of phenomena that the family initially tried to rationalize. Objects began appearing in places where no one had left them. Lee's rosary, which she religiously kept in her nightstand drawer, appeared hanging from the bathroom doorknob. Bill Sr.'s car keys, which he always left on a hook by the front door, were found inside the refrigerator between the milk cartons. A framed photograph of Dominica that hung in the living room appeared turned against the wall at dawn, although no one admitted having touched it. Deborah began experiencing her own strange encounters in the house she shared with Bill Jr. She would wake at night feeling someone pulling the sheets from the foot of the bed. She heard footsteps in the hallway when Bill Jr. worked late in his workshop. One morning she found all the kitchen knives perfectly aligned on the dining table, with the blades pointing toward the door connecting to the garden, toward Lee's house. On September 23rd, 9 days after discovering the circle in Dominica's closet, the incident occurred that forced the family to accept that something genuinely abnormal was happening. Lee was preparing dinner in her kitchen, spaghetti sauce she had cooked 1,000 times before, when one of the butcher knives stored in the wooden block on the counter flew through the air without anyone touching it. The knife crossed the kitchen in a perfectly horizontal trajectory, as if an invisible hand had thrown it with force and precision, and embedded itself with a sickening sound in the framed photograph of Lee hanging on the dining room wall. The blade pierced through the glass and Lee's smiling face in the image, burying itself more than 5 centimeters into the drywall behind. The knife vibrated for several seconds after impact, producing a high-pitched hum that made the window panes resonate in sympathy. Bill Sr. was seated in his recliner less than 3 meters away when it happened. He saw everything. There was no possible physical explanation. There was no gust of wind, no ropes or mechanisms. The knife simply flew by its own will, or by the will of something that was neither human nor natural. Lee collapsed on the kitchen floor, the rosary clutched in her hands, murmuring prayers in Italian while tears ran down her cheeks. Bill Sr. tried to remove the knife from the wall, but it was so deeply embedded that he had to use a hammer to loosen it. The photograph was destroyed, Lee's face cut in half. Deborah came running from her house upon hearing the screams and found her in-laws sitting on the sofa, pale as ghosts, unable to articulate coherent words for several minutes. That night, Deborah took 16 Polaroid photographs of the knife still embedded in the wall, of the destroyed photograph, of the hole in the drywall. Documenting had become her defense mechanism, her way of clinging to something tangible in the midst of chaos. She stored the photographs in a shoebox in her closet, not knowing that during the next 5 years that box would fill with hundreds of images that would document an escalation of unprecedented paranormal violence in California's modern history. That same early morning at exactly 3:15 like the previous night, all the mirrors in the 3 houses appeared with messages written in soap. In Lee's house, she was promised. In Bill Jr. and Deborah's house, you cannot hide. And in Dominica's empty house, on the bathroom mirror where the elderly woman had looked at herself for the last time before dying, I am the prince. I have come to collect. Bill Sr. called the Rancho Cucamonga police at dawn. 2 officers arrived, checked the houses, took photographs, and filled out a report. But when Bill Sr. tried to explain the flying knife, he saw instant skepticism on the agents' faces. Vandals, they suggested. Maybe someone with a key to the house. Had the family had any recent conflict with neighbors? Problems with any former employee? The officers left behind the devastating feeling of being completely alone facing something that modern institutions could neither acknowledge nor wanted to recognize. Lee didn't sleep that night, nor the next. She began praying the complete rosary every 3 hours, her lips constantly moving in silent prayers. She called Father Martinez, the priest from St. Peter's who had officiated Dominica's funeral, and begged him to come bless the houses. The father arrived 2 days later with holy water and minor exorcism prayers, sprinkling every room while reciting in Latin. But when he was blessing Dominica's former room, the priest stopped abruptly in the middle of a prayer. "There's something here," he whispered, his normally serene face contorted by an expression of genuine fear. "Something ancient and very, very angry. I can't stay. I need to leave. Now." Father Martinez walked out of the house quickly, almost running, and left without finishing the blessing. He never returned despite Lee's desperate phone pleas during the following weeks. Years later, when he finally agreed to speak with paranormal investigators about that day, Father Martinez admitted that he had felt a presence in that room that was fundamentally malevolent, something that was not a simple tormented spirit but a conscious intelligence that had looked at him with pure hatred and had shown him, in a flash of vision he could never fully explain, images of violence and blood that would make his own prayers seem like useless whispers against a hurricane. On October 1, 1987, exactly 39 days after Dominica's death, the Moffitt family understood with devastating clarity that what had begun would not end soon, and that Lee was the target of something that had waited patiently for centuries to finally manifest and claim what it considered its own by right of a contract sealed with blood on a dark night that the family had never witnessed but whose effects they would live every day during the next 2,000 hellish days. October 1987 marked the Moffitt family's descent into an abyss of terror that would defy all rational understanding. What had begun as disturbing but occasional phenomena transformed into a constant and increasingly violent siege. The entity calling itself the Prince was no longer content with messages on mirrors or objects moved from place to place. Now it sought to terrorize, destroy, and, as became clear in its increasingly frequent written communications, separate Lee from this world by any means necessary. The first week of October, Deborah woke at 2:40 in the morning to a crash that shook her house as if a truck had collided with the structure. She ran to the living room along with Bill Jr. and they found that all the furniture had been relocated during the night while they slept. The sofa was flipped upside down. The dining room chairs were stacked in a wobbling tower reaching the ceiling. The coffee table stood on one of its corners, impossibly balanced like a dancer frozen mid-pirouette. And on the wall, carved deeply into the drywall with something sharp, a symbol neither of them recognized, an eye inside a 7-pointed star surrounded by letters that belonged to no known alphabet. Bill Jr. tried to rationalize the event. Maybe they had been sleepwalking. Maybe someone had drugged their food. But Deborah took her Polaroid camera and meticulously photographed every detail of the scene before they began restoring order. When she developed the images, she discovered something that made her skin crawl. In each photograph appeared humanoid shadows that didn't correspond to any identifiable light source, dark figures that seemed to observe from the corners, with slightly incorrect proportions, too tall, with limbs too long. In the central house, Lee lived in a state of constant terror. The phenomena surrounding her were personal and malicious. Her clothes appeared torn in her closet. Her family photographs appeared at dawn with faces scratched out, except hers, which always remained intact while all other faces around her were obliterated with what looked like deep scratches. The rosary that had belonged to her mother appeared one morning on her pillow, broken into pieces with each bead separated and placed forming the word cursed in crooked letters. On October 14th, Bill Sr. woke because he heard Lee talking with someone in the kitchen. It was 4 in the morning. When he came downstairs, he found his wife standing in front of the open refrigerator, staring fixedly at a message written on the metallic surface with what looked like condensation but which didn't fade. 3 more moons, Lee. Then I come for you. You cannot hide in prayers. I was invoked with blood and with blood I shall collect. Lee was completely motionless as if hypnotized. Bill Sr. had to shake her gently 3 times before she blinked and looked at him with eyes that took several seconds to focus. He was here, Lee whispered with a voice that didn't sound completely her own. I saw him. He's tall, so tall his head touched the ceiling. He doesn't have a face like humans. Yes, he has many eyes. And he knows me. He knows every sin I've committed, every lie I've told. He showed me how he's going to kill me. Bill Sr. cleaned the message from the refrigerator, but his hands trembled so much it took him 15 minutes to complete the task. He called Father Martinez again, left 7 desperate messages on the parish answering machine. The priest never returned the calls. Instead, a nun named Sister Catherine contacted the family 3 days later. She had heard about their situation and wanted to help, but when she arrived at Archibold Avenue with holy water and crucifixes, she barely lasted 20 minutes in Lee's house before fleeing with tears running down her wrinkled face. That's not a ghost, said Sister Catherine as she hurriedly got into her car, her habit fluttering in the October wind. That's something demonic, ancient, and extremely powerful. You need specialized help. I cannot face something like that. I'm sorry. I pray for you, but I cannot return. The family began desperately seeking any form of help. Lee contacted local mediums, most of whom refused to enter the houses after feeling the energy from the garden. A psychic named Monica accepted a session and lasted exactly 12 minutes before running out screaming that the entity had shown her her own death in visions so vivid she could feel the pain. She left behind her tarot cards scattered on the kitchen table, and when Deborah tried to collect them, she discovered that every card without exception showed the same image: the tower, the arcanum representing catastrophic destruction. The phenomena escalated in frequency and intensity. Every night without fail at 3:15 in the morning, the hour paranormal investigators would later call the Devil's Hour, everyone in the three houses woke simultaneously. And every night they found new messages, new symbols carved in walls, new objects relocated in physically impossible ways. Knives became the entity's favorite object. They appeared embedded in doors, buried in chair backs, forming geometric patterns on walls. Always the sharpest knives, always pointing toward Lee's bedroom. On October 26th, the situation reached a level of direct physical violence that made the family seriously consider abandoning the properties. Lee was sitting in her favorite living room chair, praying the rosary as she constantly did, when a 20-centimeter butcher knife came flying from the kitchen, crossed through the arch separating both rooms, and embedded itself in the back of Lee's chair, piercing the padded fabric barely 5 centimeters from her head. The force of impact was so great that the knife's tip completely pierced the back and emerged from the other side. Lee screamed. Bill Sr., who was in the second-floor bathroom, ran down the stairs so fast he tripped and injured his knee. He found his wife trembling violently, unable to rise from the chair, staring fixedly at the knife that vibrated slowly as it settled into its final position. On the living room mirror, written in what looked like black oil dripping slowly, a message appeared while both watched horrified: "I missed on purpose. Next time I won't miss." Deborah arrived minutes later with her camera and documented the scene. She took 17 photographs from different angles. In 3 of the revealed images appeared clearly a dark figure standing next to Lee, a shadow with vaguely human shape but completely incorrect proportions, as if someone had stretched a human silhouette until making it measure over 2 meters tall. The figure cast no shadow of its own and seemed to absorb the light around it. That night, Bill Sr. made a decision. They would temporarily move Lee to a hotel while seeking specialized professional help. They packed a suitcase with essentials and reserved a room at a Holiday Inn 15 kilometers away. Lee initially resisted, insisting that fleeing from her own house was admitting defeat, but the knife near her head had finally broken her resistance. They left after nightfall, not telling anyone where they were going, hoping physical distance would provide at least a temporary respite. The first night at the hotel was quiet. Lee slept 6 consecutive hours for the first time in weeks. But the second night, at exactly 3:15 in the morning, both woke to a sound of rhythmic knocking. On the hotel bathroom mirror, illuminated by the fluorescent light that had turned on by itself, was a message in white soap. "Did you believe distance matters? I am not bound to walls. I am bound to her." Bill Sr. called the front desk to report an intruder, but when the night manager reviewed the hallway security camera recordings, he confirmed that no one had entered or exited their room all night. The doors remained locked from the inside. There was no logical explanation. They returned to Archibold Avenue defeated and terrified. If they couldn't physically escape the entity, they would have to find another way to confront it. Deborah began researching exhaustively in local libraries, reading about demonic possessions, paranormal infestations, protection rituals. She discovered references to similar cases that had been investigated by paranormal experts. One name appeared repeatedly in her research: Ed and Lorraine Warren, Catholic demonologists from Connecticut with decades of experience in violent paranormal activity cases. But the Warrens were busy with multiple investigations and had a waiting list of months. Meanwhile, the family would have to survive as best they could. Lee stopped sleeping almost completely, surviving on 15-minute micronaps while Bill Sr. stood guard. She lost 8 kilograms in 3 weeks. Her eyes developed deep dark circles and her skin acquired a sickly grayish tone. Neighbors began asking questions the family couldn't answer honestly without sounding completely insane. On October 31st, Halloween, the entity seemed to deliberately mock the holiday. When the family woke that morning, they found that all photographs of Lee in the 3 houses had been altered during the night. In each image, someone or something had drawn with black marker a hooded figure standing next to Lee, with a scythe raised over her head. In total, 43 identically modified photographs. The precision of the work suggested hours of meticulous labor, but no one had heard anything. No one had seen anyone enter or exit. Deborah contacted a local paranormal investigator named Dr. Evelyn Puglini, a parapsychologist with genuine academic credentials from the University of California. Dr. Puglini agreed to visit the properties for an initial assessment. She arrived on November 4th with recording equipment, electromagnetic field meters, and an open but skeptical mind. What she witnessed during the following 6 hours transformed her skepticism into absolute conviction that the Moffitt family was experiencing one of the most violent cases of demonic infestation she had encountered in her 20-year career. During Dr. Puglini's visit, while she interviewed Lee in the living room, a knife came flying from the empty kitchen and embedded itself in the wall less than 30 centimeters from the investigator's head. Puglini saw it happen. She recorded it on video. The tape clearly showed the knife rising from the block on the counter, floating horizontally in the air for 2 complete seconds, and then launching violently against the wall with impossible speed. There were no ropes, no tricks. Dr. Puglini, trained to maintain scientific objectivity, admitted later that she felt genuine terror in that moment. "This is real," Puglini said with a trembling voice while packing her equipment. "Whatever is here is not a collective hallucination or a psychological phenomenon. It's a conscious and intelligent entity with capacity for physical manipulation of the environment. And it's specifically obsessed with Lee. You need immediate help from demonology experts. I'm going to make some calls." Dr. Puglini contacted several colleagues, including investigators associated with the Warrens. She wrote a detailed 6-page report documenting the phenomena she had witnessed and the family's testimonies. The report eventually reached the hands of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who upon reading it decided that the Moffitt case required their immediate attention despite their tight schedule. But that wouldn't happen until the spring of 1989, more than a year in the future. Meanwhile, November and December of 1987 brought new horrors. Physical attacks became more frequent. Lee was pushed down the stairs by an invisible force, resulting in a severe ankle sprain. Bill Jr. found his dog, a 7-year-old Labrador named Max, levitating 30 centimeters off the ground in the garage, whimpering terrified but unable to move. When the animal finally fell to the ground 5 minutes later, it fled from the property and never returned. Dominica's house, which remained empty and theoretically was going to be rented, became the epicenter of the most intense activity. No one could remain there more than 15 minutes without experiencing severe nausea, paralyzing headaches, and a sensation of terror that had no identifiable source but was so overwhelming that several potential visitors ran out before completing the tour. The house was never rented. It became a silent monument to horror, with its windows covered and its door locked with multiple locks. The messages continued appearing daily. On mirrors, on windows, carved in wood, traced in the dust accumulated on furniture. Always directed at Lee. Always counting towards something none of them fully understood. 2 moons. 1 moon. Soon, Lee. Very soon. The contract will be fulfilled. Christmas 1987 was the darkest the family had ever experienced. There was no celebration, no gifts, no traditional family gathering. Lee barely left her room. Bill Sr. slept in a chair next to her bed, a baseball bat in his hands, useless against an enemy that had no physical form but could kill as effectively as any human weapon. And in the darkness of those winter nights, while the desert wind blew from the San Gabriel Mountains and the 3 white houses on Archibold Avenue creaked under the weight of a presence that shouldn't exist according to modern physics laws, the Moffitt family understood with devastating clarity that they were waging a war they didn't know how to win against an enemy that had waited centuries to finally claim what it considered its own by right of an ancient contract sealed with innocent blood. On a night they had never witnessed but whose consequences they would live until the end. The year 1988 began with a desperation that had completely replaced the initial terror. The Moffitt family had learned to live in a constant state of vigilance, sleeping in shifts, documenting every phenomenon, seeking help anywhere that promised even a minimal possibility of relief. Deborah had already filled 3 shoeboxes with Polaroid photographs showing irrefutable evidence of what they were experiencing. Symbols carved in walls, knives embedded in impossible surfaces, sourceless shadows appearing in images as silent witnesses to their torment. In February 1988, Dr. Evelyn Puglini returned with a team of 4 additional paranormal investigators. They installed video surveillance cameras in the 3 houses, sensitive audio recording equipment capable of capturing frequencies beyond the human range, and electromagnetic meters that recorded fluctuations in energy fields. During a complete week, the team documented paranormal activity with a consistency that defied all skeptical explanation. The video recordings captured objects moving without visible physical contact. In a particularly disturbing sequence filmed at 3:18 in the morning on February 9th, a kitchen chair slides across the floor for 8 seconds, rotates 90 degrees on its axis, and then violently launches against the wall with enough force to splinter the wood of the backrest. The audio recordings registered masculine voices whispering in a language that no linguist consulted afterward could identify, along with what sounded like heavy breathing coming from rooms confirmed as empty. But the most disturbing finding was what the electromagnetic meters revealed. Every time a violent phenomenon occurred, the instruments detected massive spikes in electromagnetic activity, concentrated specifically around Lee regardless of where she was in the house. It was as if she carried with her an anomalous energy field that intensified moments before each manifestation. The investigators had never seen similar patterns in any previous case. "She's linked to the entity in some way," explained Dr. Paglini to the family after reviewing the data. "It's as if an invisible cord exists connecting her with this presence. It's not possession in the traditional sense, but something more like a mark or a claim. We need to break that link, but honestly I don't know how to do it." Through Paglini's contacts, the family began receiving visits from an endless procession of self-proclaimed specialists in the supernatural. Mediums arrived who performed sessions attempting to communicate with the entity and negotiate its departure. One of them, a 60-year-old man named Gary who claimed to have 40 years of experience, apparently managed to establish direct contact with what he called the Prince. During a session held in Lee's living room on March 18th, Gary entered a trance and his voice changed to a deeper and more resonant tone that made the window panes vibrate. He spoke in first person as if he were the entity itself. "She was promised. Black chicken blood over her image. Ancient words in the language of my ancestors. The contract is binding beyond death, beyond time. Lee belongs to me. You cannot break what was sealed with sacrifice." Lee began screaming during this communication, feeling crushing pressure in her chest as if invisible hands were strangling her. Gary came out of the trance abruptly, pale as death, and confessed he had never felt such a powerful and malevolent presence. He left Archibold Avenue that same afternoon and never returned despite the family's pleas. 2 weeks later, he called Deborah from an unknown number and told her with a trembling voice that the entity's symbol had appeared carved on the door of his new apartment 300 kilometers away. Then he hung up and never answered calls again. In April arrived a Cuban Santeria named Yolanda, recommended by an acquaintance of Deborah's who worked in Los Angeles. Yolanda was an elderly woman of 70 with completely white hair and eyes that seemed to see beyond physical surfaces. She walked through the 3 houses with a rosary in one hand and a lit cigar in the other, constantly murmuring in Spanish while examining every room. "This is Santeria," she finally said with absolute certainty. "Someone invoked a dark Orisha, one of those that have no Catholic names because they were never saints or angels. They promised your mother-in-law in sacrifice in exchange for something, probably to prolong the life of the elderly woman who died. But the ritual went wrong or was done by someone who didn't know how to control what they were invoking. Now the entity is here and won't leave until it collects what was promised." Yolanda performed a spiritual cleansing that lasted 3 complete days. She sacrificed white roosters in the house's yards, drew protection symbols with red chalk on thresholds, burned herbs that filled the air with thick smoke that made eyes water. She sang in ancient African languages, invoking protective entities to confront the prince. And for the first time in months, during those 3 days of intense ritual, the phenomena ceased completely. The nights were silent. There were no messages on mirrors. The knives remained still in their places. The family felt hope for the first time since August of the previous year. Maybe Yolanda had found the solution. Maybe they were finally free. They paid her generously, thanked her with tears in their eyes, and the Santeria left with the warning to keep the protection symbols intact and pray daily to Santa Barbara, the Catholic manifestation of Chango, the warrior Orisha. The peace lasted exactly 9 days. On the night of April 30th at 3:15 in the morning, Lee woke feeling something watching her from the dark corner of her room. She turned on the light and screamed. All the protection symbols that Yolanda had drawn on her bedroom walls had been erased, replaced by a single message carved deeply into the drywall with 30-centimeter tall letters. "And no Orisha can stop me. I am prior to their names. I am the prince of what was before there was light." The violent phenomena returned with redoubled vengeance. Knives not only flew now but appeared embedded in increasingly threatening places. One pierced Lee's pillow while she was in the bathroom, burying itself exactly where her head had been resting 30 seconds earlier. Another appeared vertically embedded in the seat of her favorite chair, with the tip pointing up, waiting. If she had sat without looking, the blade would have seriously injured her. In May, Deborah contacted a group of evangelical Protestant pastors who specialized in spiritual deliverance. 5 men arrived with Bibles, anointing oil, and unwavering confidence in the power of Jesus Christ to expel any demon. They performed a prayer session for 6 hours, shouting expulsion orders, anointing doorframes with oil, declaring that Christ's authority was superior to any demonic entity. During the ritual, while the lead pastor loudly declared he was ordering the demon to leave the property in Jesus' name, an invisible force lifted him 30 centimeters off the ground and threw him against the wall with enough violence to cause a mild concussion. The other 4 pastors fled the house immediately, carrying their unconscious colleague to their vehicle. When the pastor regained consciousness in the hospital 2 hours later, he couldn't remember his own name for 15 minutes and never spoke publicly again about what he had experienced on Archibold Avenue. Lee had already lost 14 kilograms. Her hair had begun showing completely white streaks that weren't there 3 months before. She slept maybe 2 hours each night, constantly waking with nightmares where a tall, faceless figure pursued her through endless rooms. Her doctor prescribed anxiety medications and sleeping sedatives, but the pills seemed useless against a terror that wasn't chemical but existential. Bill Sr. had developed stomach ulcers from constant stress. Deborah suffered chronic migraines that no painkiller could alleviate. Bill Jr. had begun drinking more than he should, seeking any escape from the horror that had completely consumed their lives. The family was falling apart physically and mentally, and the entity seemed to feed on their suffering, becoming stronger and bolder with each passing day. In July arrived a Native American shaman who had read about the case through the informal network of paranormal investigators. He was called Thunderhawk and was a 50-year-old Lakota man with genuine credentials as a spiritual leader of his tribe. He performed a purification ceremony with white sage, established a protection circle using sacred stones, and sang prayers in his native language for hours. "The spirit here is ancient," said Thunderhawk after completing his assessment. "But it doesn't belong to this land. It comes from another place, was brought by rituals that don't respect natural balance. I can strengthen your spiritual defenses, but I cannot completely expel it. That will require someone with specific authority over this class of entity." For 3 weeks after the shaman's visit, the phenomena diminished in intensity but didn't cease. It was as if the entity was testing the new spiritual defenses, seeking weaknesses, and eventually it found them. At the end of July, the violent attacks returned with full force. On August 5, 1988, exactly 1 year after Dominica's death, the family finally received the call they had been desperately waiting for months. Lorraine Warren was on the phone, her voice warm but serious. She and her husband Ed had reviewed all the documentation sent by Dr. Paglini, had seen the photographs, read the reports, listened to the audio recordings. They were convinced that the Moffitt case was genuine and extremely dangerous. "But we're completely booked until February 1989, Lorraine explained with an apologetic tone. "We have active cases we cannot abandon. However, I'm going to give you specific instructions you must follow until we can arrive. And I want you to know something important. What you're facing is real, it's powerful, but it's not invincible. We've dealt with similar entities before. You can survive this." Lorraine gave them a detailed list of protections. Maintain holy water in every room, pray the complete rosary 3 times daily, never directly challenge the entity or show extreme fear, keep all lights on during hours of greatest activity, and above all, remain united as a family because division was what the entity sought to create. The family followed the instructions meticulously. Bill Sr. obtained 20 liters of holy water from 5 different churches. Lee prayed until her lips cracked from dryness. Deborah continued obsessively documenting every phenomenon, now accumulating more than 400 photographs showing irrefutable evidence of what no rational person would want to believe possible. The months between August 1988 and February 1989 were a war of attrition. The entity attacked constantly but spiritual defenses provided partial protection. Lee suffered 3 incidents where she was physically pushed or struck by invisible forces, resulting in extensive bruising and a fractured rib. But she survived. Each day was a small victory against something that clearly had the power to kill her but seemed to be playing a cruel game, prolonging the terror. In December, a young Catholic priest named Father Thomas agreed to attempt a minor exorcism, the strongest blessing ritual permitted without special authorization from the bishopric. During the ceremony held in Lee's living room, while the father read in Latin from the Rituale Romanum, all the mirrors in the house simultaneously cracked with a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. Father Thomas completed the ritual with trembling but admirable determination. "I don't have sufficient authority to expel something like this," he admitted afterward. You would need an exorcist officially ordained by the Vatican. But I've done what I can. May God protect you until real help arrives. January 1989 brought the coldest winter Rancho Cucamonga had experienced in 20 years. The nights became freezing and the Moffitts spent them huddled under blankets, waiting for the 3:15 in the morning knocks that never failed to come. Lee had developed a permanent expression of fear in her eyes, a distant look of someone who has seen too much and can no longer remember what it felt like to feel safe. But there was a light at the end of the dark tunnel. Ed and Lorraine Warren would arrive in February. The most famous demonologists in the United States, with decades of experience confronting what the modern world preferred to deny, would finally come to Archibold Avenue. The family clung to that hope like shipwrecked people to a life preserver in a stormy ocean. What none of them knew was that even the Warrens, with all their experience and unwavering faith, would find in the Moffitt case one of the most challenging and terrifying of their entire career, and that the battle for Lee's life was barely beginning to reveal itself in all its ancient and terrible complexity. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived in Rancho Cucamonga on February 14, 1989, Valentine's Day, a date the Moffitt family would remember forever as the moment when finally someone with true spiritual authority crossed the threshold of their haunted houses. Ed was a robust 62-year-old man with gray hair and a presence that inspired immediate confidence. Lorraine, his 61-year-old wife, possessed penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see layers of reality invisible to others. During the first 4 hours, the Warrens simply listened. They sat in Lee's living room while the family recounted 18 months of lived horror. Deborah presented the 6 shoeboxes filled with Polaroid photographs, more than 600 images documenting every aspect of the torment. Symbols carved in walls, impossibly embedded knives, messages on mirrors, sourceless shadows captured on film. Ed examined each image with the meticulousness of a detective, taking notes in a worn notebook. Lorraine frequently closed her eyes, using her clairvoyant abilities to perceive the layers of energy permeating the property. "This is authentic," Ed finally said with absolute gravity. "And it's one of the most violent cases we've encountered. Lorraine, what are you feeling?" Lorraine opened her eyes and looked directly at Lee with an expression mixing compassion and deep concern. "There's a connection between you and the entity that isn't natural. Something was done, some blood ritual that bound you to an extremely ancient demonic presence. This entity calls itself Prince, but that's not its true name. Its real name would be unpronounceable in human languages. It has existed for millennia and was specifically invoked with your image and your name." Lee began crying silently. After 18 months of terror, finally someone with credibility acknowledged she wasn't losing her sanity, that everything was horrifyingly real. The Warrens established their base of operations in the central house and began an intensive investigation that would last 5 days. They installed additional recording equipment, performed religious provocation sessions designed to make the entity manifest while being documented, and interviewed every person who had had contact with the case. Dr. Puglini arrived on the second day with her own records and collaborated closely with the investigators. During the night of February 15th, while Ed performed a provocation session in Dominica's former house, the entity responded with fury. The Warrens had installed 4 video cameras at different angles in the room. The recordings captured phenomena that were later analyzed by video technicians who confirmed there was no manipulation. A chair levitating for 43 seconds, objects flying in trajectories that violated basic physical laws, and most disturbing, a humanoid shadow that visibly materialized in a corner of the room for almost 2 complete minutes. Ed, who had remained firm during the entire session praying in Latin, admitted later that he felt a presence of evil so concentrated that his body physically reacted with nausea and dizziness. Lorraine, who was watching from the neighboring house using video monitors, reported having clairvoyantly seen an entity of impossible height, without recognizable human facial features, standing next to Ed during the entire session, studying him with what she described as malicious curiosity. "This demon is intelligent and patient," Ed explained to the family after reviewing the recordings. "It's been playing with you, feeding on your fear. It could have killed Lee at any moment during these months, but it's deliberately prolonging the suffering. That tells us something important. It enjoys the process as much as it anticipates the final outcome." Lorraine performed multiple sessions attempting to communicate with the entity through her clairvoyance. During one of these sessions, she entered a trance-like state and her voice subtly changed while relating what she perceived. "I see a woman in clothing from another era, from another place. Guatemala, perhaps Honduras. She's performing a ritual with black candles and blood. There's a photograph of Lee in the center of the circle. The woman is desperate, asking for more time for someone who's dying. but she doesn't know what she's invoking. She doesn't understand the price she's offering in exchange. The contract is sealed before she fully understands the terms. This vision confirmed the family's suspicions about Juanita and the ritual she had probably performed. But knowing the origin of the problem didn't automatically provide the solution. The Warrens explained that breaking a demonic contract sealed with blood and specific rituals required high-level religious intervention, potentially a complete exorcism that could only be authorized by a bishop after exhaustive investigation. During the 5 days of investigation, the Warrens documented 17 distinct paranormal phenomena, including 3 instances of objects moving without visible physical contact while cameras recorded. Ed performed multiple blessings and protection prayers. Lorraine worked personally with Lee, teaching her spiritual defense techniques and strengthening her mentally against the demon's constant assault. But the most impactful moment came on the last night of their visit. The Warrens, along with the complete family, performed a group prayer session in Lee's living room. While they prayed the rosary aloud, everyone present felt a change in the atmosphere, as if the air pressure had dramatically increased. Then, on the large mirror in the living room while everyone watched, a message appeared writing itself letter by letter as if an invisible hand traced the words in real time. She is mine. You cannot break what was sealed. Leave before I claim you too. Ed stood up and faced the mirror directly. In the name of Jesus Christ, I order you not to touch this family. You have no authority here. Lee is under the protection of Almighty God and your contract is null before His power. The mirror violently cracked from corner to corner with a sound like a gunshot. Everyone jumped back. But Ed remained firm, continuing his prayers in Latin. Lorraine joined him, and together they created what they described as a spiritual shield around Lee using specific prayers and unwavering faith. Before leaving on February 19th, the Warrens had a final conversation with the family that Deborah recorded on an audio cassette. The recording survives to this day in the case files. What you have here is a demonic infestation of extreme level, Ed said with a serious but not hopeless voice. The entity is powerful and has a spiritual legal claim on Lee due to the ritual performed. But that claim can be nullified with sufficient faith and appropriate ritual. We're going to contact the Diocese of San Bernardino to request a formal exorcism. Meanwhile, you must maintain the defenses we've taught you. Pray constantly. Never show extreme fear because that feeds it. And above all, stay united. Lorraine added something that would be engraved in the family's memory. I've seen many cases throughout my life, but this demon is different. It's ancient beyond human comprehension. It existed when humanity was barely learning to make fire. But it has made a mistake. It underestimates the power of family love and genuine faith. Lee, you are stronger than you think. This entity wants you to believe you're defenseless, but you're not. You have free will, you have faith, and you have a family that would give their lives for you. The Warrens left taking with them copies of all documentation to present before ecclesiastical authorities. They promised to return when necessary. And they left the family with something they hadn't had in months: genuine hope. The following months brought continuous spiritual warfare. The phenomena never ceased completely, but the spiritual defenses taught by the Warrens provided significant protection. Lee was physically attacked 3 more times during 1989, but each time she managed to defend herself using the specific prayers Lorraine had taught her. The entity's power seemed to be gradually diminishing, or perhaps Lee's resistance was strengthening. In October 1989, the diocese finally sent an exorcist priest to evaluate the case. Father Michael was a 50-year-old man with experience in possession and demonic oppression cases. He spent 3 days on the properties and confirmed it was genuine demonic oppression, although technically not possession since the entity hadn't taken control of Lee's body but was attacking her externally. I can perform blessings and deliverance prayers, Father Michael explained, but a complete exorcism would require evidence of direct possession. However, what I can do is strengthen the spiritual defenses of this property and specifically bless Lee with prayers against demonic oppression. For 2 weeks, Father Michael performed daily rituals. He blessed every room with holy water consecrated specifically for this purpose. He performed masses in the central house. He taught the family protection prayers in Latin. And gradually, the phenomena began to decrease in frequency and intensity. The year 1990 brought significant changes. Violent attacks became sporadic instead of daily. Mirror messages appeared maybe once a month instead of every night. Knives remained in their places. It was as if the entity was losing its grip on physical reality, or as if the spiritual defenses were finally working. In April 1990, something extraordinary occurred. Lee woke one morning and for the first time in almost 3 years, She didn't feel the oppressive presence that had constantly accompanied her. The air seemed lighter. The house felt like just a house, not like a spiritual battlefield. That night, the entire family slept completely without being awakened at 3:15 in the morning. For 3 months, the calm continued. The family began daring to believe that maybe, finally, the nightmare had ended. Lee regained weight. Color returned to her cheeks. Bill Sr. could stop taking medication for his ulcer. Deborah began sleeping without nightmares. But in July 1990, one last message appeared. Not on a mirror or carved on a wall, but on a sheet of paper that appeared at dawn on Lee's pillow, written with perfect calligraphy in red ink. "I'm not finished. I'm just waiting. The contract remains. I'll return when you least expect it. This isn't over, Lee. It never ends." Lee took the paper to Father Michael, who blessed it and burned it in a special ceremony. "The demon is trying to keep fear alive," the priest explained, "but its power over you is broken. This is a last desperate attempt to control you psychologically. Don't give it that power." During the following years, phenomena continued occurring occasionally but with much less intensity. An object moved here, a shadow seen peripherally there, a whisper heard in the early morning. But the extreme violence of the first years never returned. It was as if the entity had been contained, not completely expelled, but reduced to a whisper instead of the roar it had been. Bill Jr. died in 2012 of natural causes, a heart attack at 56. While Deborah was cleaning his belongings a month later, she discovered that her husband had secretly kept copies of hundreds of the photographs she thought she had destroyed years earlier following advice from various investigators. Bill had preserved the evidence in secret, unable to destroy the proof of what they had lived through. It was then that Deborah finally decided to tell the story publicly. For 25 years they had kept silent, fearful of ridicule, simply trying to survive. But with the rediscovered photographs and the distance of time providing perspective, Deborah felt the story needed to be shared. In 2015 she published the book Unwelcomed, the true story of the Moffitt family haunting, collaborating with her daughter Jessica, who had been born in 1990 and had grown up hearing fragments of the story but without personally experiencing the most terrible years. The book contained more than 100 original photographs and testimonies from all investigators who had participated in the case. Dr. Evelyn Paglini wrote the foreword, confirming the authenticity of the phenomena she had personally witnessed. The Warrens' video recordings were included as evidence. In 2023, Blumhouse Productions acquired the film rights to adapt the story, recognizing that the Moffitt case represented one of the best documented episodes of demonic oppression in modern history. The film is currently in development. Lee Moffitt died in 2016 at the age of 89, of natural causes and surrounded by her family. Until her last days, she maintained that the entity had never completely left her, that she could feel its presence watching her from the shadows, waiting patiently. But she also insisted that her faith and her family's love had kept her alive when the demon wanted to destroy her. "I won," Lee told Deborah a few days before her death, her voice weak but her determination intact. "It promised it would come to claim me, but I lived my complete life. I raised my children, met my grandchildren, experienced love and joy despite the horror. The contract said I belonged to it, but my soul always belonged to God. That's what demons never understand. They cannot claim us if we don't allow them to." Deborah still lives in one of the houses on Archibold Avenue. Dominica's former house was finally demolished in 2005 after remaining empty for almost 20 years. No tenant ever lasted more than 2 weeks before fleeing terrified by inexplicable phenomena. Lee's house was sold to a young family in 2017 who didn't know the complete story. They reported some strange experiences during the first year, but after a priest extensively blessed the property, the phenomena ceased. The Moffitt case remains as one of the best documented in paranormal investigation archives. The photographs, audio and video recordings, testimonies from multiple independent investigators, and the extraordinary duration of the case make it convincing evidence for those who seriously study the paranormal. Skeptics argue there must be rational explanations not yet discovered, but no one who has reviewed the complete evidence can deny that something extraordinary and terrifying occurred in 3 white houses in Rancho Cucamonga during 6 years that defied all logic. Some questions remain unanswered to this day. Who exactly was Juanita and where is she now? What specific ritual did she perform and why did she choose to promise Lee instead of offering something else? Was the entity truly an ancient demon as the Warrens concluded, or something even stranger and more inexplicable? Why did it gradually lose its power instead of fulfilling its final threat? Ed Warren, who died in 2006, once said about the Moffitt case, In 40 years investigating the paranormal, I saw many things that defy explanation. But the Prince of Rancho Cucamonga was different. He was patient in a way demons normally aren't. He played with his prey like a cat with a mouse. And although we managed to protect Lee, I was never completely sure we had won or just postponed the inevitable. Some mysteries don't have clear endings, only pauses and stories that could continue in dimensions we cannot perceive. Lorraine Warren, who died in 2019, visited Deborah for the last time in 2018. She was 91 and her health was declining, but she insisted on making the trip to California one last time. She sat in the living room where so many years earlier she had fought alongside the family against the invisible, and said something Deborah will never forget. The evil that attacked your family was real and ancient, but the love that kept you united was stronger. That's the lesson of the Moffitt case I want the world to remember. Evil exists, demons are real, but human love and genuine faith are more powerful weapons than any darkness. Lee won not because the demons surrendered, but because she refused to surrender first. Today, when Deborah looks at the San Gabriel Mountains from her window, the same mountains that watched silently while her family waged war against the impossible, she reflects on how life can change in an instant. An elderly woman dies. A caregiver performs a desperate ritual. And 3 generations of a family are dragged into an abyss of horror they never imagined possible. But they survived. And by surviving, they left a record that others can study, learn from, perhaps believe. The photographs exist. The recordings remain. The testimonies are documented. And somewhere in the shadows between what we know and what we fear to know, the mystery of the Prince of Rancho Cucamonga waits, patient as it has always been, reminding us there are things in this world and beyond that modern science still cannot fully explain or deny. The Moffitt family learned that some contracts transcend life and death, that some promises resonate through dimensions we barely comprehend, and that when darkness comes to claim what it believes is its own, only unwavering love and genuine faith can keep the light burning until dawn breaks.